who are coming to be Americans, and what does that mean for our sort of personal responsibility as citizens of this country. So, immigration. Almost everybody in America is an immigrant as a percentage of the population, and our country really wouldn't survive without immigrants. So although there's a lot of us and them rhetoric around who should be here, who gets to be here, how they came here, and what sort of moral judgments we should make on that basis, really there is no America without immigration. This is increasingly true as birth rates in developed countries around the world plummet, and the only means we have of having a sustainable future with healthcare systems and Social Security that can support each new generation is immigration. The only reason that we have a viable economy and a future right now is because of immigrants. We owe everything to immigrants in this country. So, starting at probably the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, we started having a discourse about which people we wanted. Who are the good, desirable humans? No surprises. It was a tremendously xenophobic, racist, ableist sort of paradigm about which humans we wanted, the ones who were like us. Right? So at the time, and it seems almost quaint to look back and think this now, it's like, oh, those Irish people, those Polish people, right? Those were undesirable. Because the sense of who we wanted in this country, who was like us, and us is always the group that's in power, were like people from England, some of the earlier pilgrims who had come over, who were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Catholics were undesirable, right? Those categories no longer have the same sort of racial valence now that they do. We don't think about like anti-Irish discrimination in 2024, but there's always someone who is on the other side of the good human, bad human debate. All of the rage at the time was the pseudoscience of eugenics, of race. We wanted to give, in every generation there's some new idea about what's the right way, what we know now that our poor ignorant ancestors didn't know. So for a long time it was Christianity, those poor ignorant people who don't know Christianity, they're not like us. And then as science began to replace religion as the dominant cultural paradigm, it was, well, science tells us that we're superior, scientifically superior, and we came up with all of these rationalizations around that. So if you look at some of the early immigration statutes, they're tremendously ableist. It's about health, some of it's about the size of the cranium. And when people came in through Ellis Island, and a lot of folks would say, well, my family came to this country legally, either fail to fully appreciate or don't know that at the time, the process to come to America was to come here and try to enter. Much like many people are doing on our southern border right now. There was not a visa system, there was not a lottery, people just came here. And the powers that be in America at the time would say, oh, we don't want Chinese people, we don't want Jews, we don't want people who look sick. And people who would be quarantined at Ellis Island, it was often very haphazard who would be deemed healthy to come in and who would be quarantined and who would be sent back. In light of all of this, over time, the out-group becomes the in-group, and once that group gains power, one of the ways that that establishes itself as an in-group is then to pick a new out-group. So right now, the out-group that we're looking at is mostly coming to the United States from Central and South America. The first big wave of folks coming from Mexico was in the 1960s with the Braceros program. This was a program to allow agricultural workers to come in mostly to California. And Americans, not necessarily your average American who wasn't involved in immigration politics, but business owners, farmers, loved this. This was a tremendous source of labor that could be paid below market wages, that wouldn't file for workers' comp, and honestly built a lot of the agricultural infrastructure that feeds us to this day. That program was tremendously exploitive, and as the abuses of that program became worse and harder to ignore, and people who had participated in that program began to advocate for themselves, it was eventually shut down. But it didn't shut down the need for agricultural labor, and it didn't shut down the sort of inequality of opportunity that made people say, I want to try to come here because I can get a better life for my family, I can get higher wages. If I bring my kids here, they can get an education in American schools, and they'll grow up to have job availabilities to them that are not just agricultural jobs, that might be learned jobs that can support the next generation. So that promise of a better life, which has motivated immigrants to the United States since there was a United States, continues to be motivating to folks. And as we continue to see really the devastation of government, infrastructure, and the rule of law in multiple countries in Central and South America, Venezuela has been crumbling. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador have all had tremendous amounts of gang violence, and the governments have not been successful at repressing them. In some cases, various entities within the government or even leadership in the government are on the bankroll of gang leadership, and it becomes increasingly hard to just eke out a life, be a person. I'll tell some of those stories when I finish my little legal overview, and please stop me if if you want more detail on something, or something I say is confusing, or you have a thought or a question. I do want this to be interactive. As those countries have been hit very hard by globalization, by climate change, and by sort of polarized politics, some of it funded by the United States, thinking, we're safer if these guys who want to trade with us are in power, no matter what they're doing to people in their own country. Folks in that country have tried to get out for safety and come here for a better life. That's been happening for, at this point, close to 70 years, but gets worse and worse and worse. And I'll say, just as this is my opinion, is that as climate change and globalization keep shifting the landscape around us, globally, we're gonna need to move all the humans. We have humans all over the globe, and a lot of places where humans live now are not gonna continue to be places that humans can live. Whether that's because of war, or access to water, or heats that are survivable for human bodies, whatever it is, some bonkers percentage of humans will need to move to countries they don't currently have citizenship in the next 50 years. That's gonna happen. The question is it gonna happen humanely and planfully, with places for people to go and opportunities for cultural continuity and support? Or is it gonna happen where we don't plan for it and people flee for their lives because humans are resilient and try to survive, and the ones who get in, and the ones who don't, and the chips will fall where they may, and what's left at the end of that is going to be devastating to human diversity, to the countries that remain. We have a choice here. So right now our opportunity is to lay the groundwork for mass human migration, because that will happen and we all know it. We have the data. We see that even parts of the United States right now are becoming uninhabitable because of lack of access to water, because human temperatures go outside the range of human survivability. So all of that is coming, and the question is, how are we going to handle it? Are we going to plan and treat everybody humanely or not? So, not looking good right now, but for the current crisis, which is largely political, and some of that politics is driven by money, and some of that money is driven by climate change, but that's not the biggest impetus yet. That's what's coming. Right now is driven by people who are fleeing their countries of origin because of terrible, terrible violence and economic conditions. Those people come to the United States and attempt to lawfully seek citizenship. The laws of the United States allow people to seek what's called asylum. Asylum is where you say, I have a credible fear that if I return to my country of origin, I'll be killed, or I'll be seriously injured because of my identity. And there's a number of identities: race, religion, ethnicity, national origin, and a particular social group. The last one is the biggest, because so many people are persecuted for things that are not necessarily falling into the neat categories of race or religion, or so a particular social group can include people who don't want to be trafficked, people who resist being sex trafficked by a gang, people who refuse to become drug runners for a gang. For a long time it included domestic violence, women who are going to be murdered by their intimate partners. Thanks to Attorney General Jeff Sessions, that stopped being a viable category. But for people who are LGBTQ+, who are non-gender conforming, that was a category that people used a lot. And we made a special rule for people coming from China who either had been or were going to be forcibly sterilized because of the one-child policy. So, once you can establish that, you have the right to seek asylum, and the United States has to put you through a judicial process to determine if you should have asylum. The narrative that people coming to this country illegally are breaking the law is simply false. It is totally legal to seek asylum. It is illegal behavior that is explicitly contemplated by Congress, right? There's a statute and everything. The question is, how do you get here? And do you present at a lawful port? Or do you come in and then find an authority and say, hey, I'm here? And how long does it take you to find that authority? So one of the big problems for this process has been that people don't know where to go. There's no, hey, come here, and if you're literate in, say, Quiche instead of Spanish, right? It's not like you can go on the State Department website from your amazing internet connection where you're living and figure out where your lawful port of entry is. Most people who are fleeing for their lives find somebody who knows somebody who says, this guy can get you there. And this guy takes you in, and he takes you, through the Rio Grande. He takes you through the river under cover of night. And then you get picked up, and the narrative is you did something illegal. You didn't know where you were supposed to go, right? And then the United States has done everything, really in the last 20 years, but stepping up and up and up, to restrict access to ports of entry. That's why there is a camp, an appalling mess of human rights abuses camp on the United States-Mexico border, where people are waiting to present themselves at a port of entry, which they have a right to do under United States law, right? They're just waiting and waiting and waiting, because the United States, for several years, had what was called Title 42, where they said you had to remain in Mexico. You couldn't just present yourself, you had to stay in Mexico. And they would only allow a few hours a day for presentation. There became a huge backlog. So even the folks who knew that they should go to a particular port of entry didn't have access to that point of entry. And then when they did, they weren't admitted, and it was, okay, stay in this camp. Now, the conditions in this camp, there's no running water, there's no bathroom facilities at scale, there's rampant violence, theft, kidnapping for ransom, sexual assault, really, really terrible conditions. These are people who have fled with everything they own on their back, with children, who have been through terrible, terrible situations even to get to this camp in Mexico. So as you can see, we have a terrible human rights crisis brewing. It's been going on now for a long time. Part of the challenge has been the national rhetoric around immigration, with the Republicans taking a very isolationist, protectionist position, and the Democrats maybe taking a lesser one, but the actual policies have not been great. They have not been a lot better. President Obama deported many, many, many more folks than his Republican predecessor. And President Biden, so far, many more people have been expelled under Title 42 than were expelled under Trump. And Biden has kind of pivoted on immigration because it's such a hot-button issue in political discourse. But none of that changes the reality on the ground for people who are either in a camp in Mexico or in immigration detention. Bringing me to immigration detention. The next thing I want to mention is that we have this system where, for some reason, somebody who is engaged in lawful behavior and come here in fear for their lives and asked to be given asylum in the United States is then put in what we call detention, but it's a nice word for jail, right? They haven't done anything illegal, but we've decided that it's better for them to remain in detention because of this, oh, they'll go and they'll never come back and we'll never see them again, and that would be so terrible idea. So we actually keep people in detention, which is tremendously expensive. The experience of it is terrible. It's really inhumane. A lot of these folks are kids. They're missing school, and they're in these weird, like metal corrugated roof prefab housing units in Texas with no AC, and the food is food they've never eaten before, and people are bored and hopeless, and the health conditions suck, and health care sucks, and people don't know how long they're going to be there. There's no right to a timeline in your processing. So some people spend years just sitting in jail for the crime of having fled, whatever violence they were fleeing. So that's kind of the legal framework in which we find ourselves. For those of you who've heard of the Dreamers, which I felt worth mentioning, the DREAM Act has never been passed. It's one of those confusing things. It was first proposed in 2001 by Dick Durbin and Orrin Hatch. It was bipartisan at the time. I have had some bizarre moments of thinking I never thought I would say Orrin Hatch, had done some things that I was happy about and felt that he was right about, but this was one of them. He also said something about polycystic ovarian syndrome being a public health crisis, which I was like, when did Orrin Hatch get so heads up about women's health? I did not have it on my bingo card. But anyway, it has been repeatedly rejected. There have been, I think, 11 attempts to get it through, and it's been repeatedly rejected. What did finally get through was in, I think, 2012, it's either 2011 or 2012, was the first iteration of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And this meant that people who had come to the United States as children, and in one of the iterations you had to be under 16, and another under 17, and another under 18, and lived here continuously, gone to school here, you had to show that you were in high school or had a high school degree, and that you hadn't become a terrible person, committed a crime of moral turpitude, and this could be like getting arrested for smoking pot, or a traffic ticket, or some other thing that ran afoul of whatever criminal code in the town that you lived in. If you could show all of those things, you could say, okay, we're not going to give you citizenship, but we're not going to kick you out either, and we'll give you a work permit. You'll be on deferred action. And once you register for deferred action, you then have to re-register every several number of years, depending on what the current statute says. So DACA was renewed in 2021 by just barely, and a group of people then went and re-registered. But I will say, DACA kids are scared. They're scared to register. Not everybody registers during the window, and if you don't register during the window, then you're stuck. It was renewed, and I think it was like a year and a half maybe, and then a federal judge sitting in Texas said it's unconstitutional and you can't continue. That case is currently working its way up, but the situation right now is you can apply for DACA, and you can turn in your application, but the Department of Homeland Security can't process it. They are under a preliminary injunction preventing them from processing these applications, and that's in a holding pattern. So people who currently have DACA can keep it and can continue to re-register for now. Nobody new will get registered because the department can't process the applications, although you can still turn in your application. It's just like Kafkaesque, right? So that is the current situation for Dreamers, for these kids who really, this is the country they grew up in, this is the country they have dedicated their civic activities to, they participate in our national life, and going to some other country that they didn't grow up in would really dispossess them in every way. Nevertheless, we have not yet made a pathway to citizenship for those folks. The most we've done is that you can work while you're here if you register and keep your registration. So that is our current legal landscape. Title 42, which was the Remain in Mexico, was ended in May of 2023. So technically at this point, you don't have to remain in Mexico. The other little wrinkle is if you spend time in a different country besides the United States before you get here, you have to show that you couldn't have safely stayed there. So that gets complicated for reasons that I'll dive into now. So I first began, well, probably honestly, I began at the Legal Aid Society in 2010 doing domestic violence law, but nobody else spoke Spanish in the unit of the attorneys. They had plenty of other folks at Legal Aid who did speak Spanish, but none of the attorneys in the domestic violence unit. So I ended up taking all the cases for folks who were Spanish speakers, and met a lot of folks who had people in their families that had these kind of challenges. Western New York is an agricultural center, it is a dairy center, and the majority of that labor is done by folks who come here for work or live here for work, and some percentage, but not a high percentage, have the proper documents to stay and not fear for their safety or their families, but a lot of folks don't. People are called migrant laborers sometimes. That term is often but not always accurate. People who live here year-round, like dairy laborers, are not migrants, they live here. They're just residents, right? But some people come seasonally and sort of will work through the season, do this fruit or vegetable when it comes in the early spring, and then I'll move here for this, and you sort of follow the seasons. So tons of folks, a lot of folks living in and around Monroe County. The folks who come to court for domestic violence assistance are the ones with papers. They're the ones who aren't worried they're going to get deported. But they all know somebody who needs help and can't get it or is afraid to get it. Now, in theory, the family court has no reason to check your citizenship, right? If I go to family court and say, I'm in danger at home, please help me, they don't ask me, bring your passport and show us that you're an American citizen. Nor should they. They have no basis to do that to anyone, right? But we've come to this moment probably since 9/11, where we started checking people's citizenship and immigration histories at all sorts of governmental touch points. So activists who were fighting against this began to call it crimmigration, where you would have police officers who would stop someone, and their only reason to check somebody's status would be because they look like they're from a different country in that person's mind, or they're speaking Spanish, like many Americans don't speak Spanish, right? And then people began being scared that they would be picked up and deported. These are many people with American citizen children who would be ripped away from their families, people who were their family's sole breadwinners, right? And if they're taken, their family is going to be destitute. It's really serious. So people became so scared, they stopped participating in civic life in any way that interfaced with the government. So I would have clients who would be like, oh, you know, they can't go to parent-teacher conferences. They're afraid to go to the food bank, right? Because we've created such a culture of like screening people for citizenship that's really only done for people who seem honestly Latino. That's the main category that people are sort of racistly screened for. So, that sort of led me to being heads up about some of these issues. We had an immigration unit. I took a few cases under the Violence Against Women Act, which allows you to apply for citizenship based on your marriage to an American citizen without that American citizen's help if you can show that you are a victim of domestic violence. That was around 2014, and I don't know if everybody remembers, because our news cycle has been so dizzying for so long, but there was a spike of unaccompanied minors seeking asylum at the US-Mexico border. And I was talking with a couple of my friends, and we were like, what could we do? And we ended up fundraising to send a bunch of lawyers down to the border, myself included, to start giving legal representation to these kids, to see what we could do to kind of help them through the system. So I actually went during one of the first weeks that the Dilley Detention Center in Dilley, Texas was open. And then I went back in 2018 when family separation began, and the project had really grown and become a really well-run project. But what it does is it takes lawyers from all around the country who are willing to go and volunteer, and you do these like 14-hour days in this airless trailer on this giant mud field, helping people with their credible fear interviews, which is the first step in the asylum process. And you hear story after story after story. And it really it hits you hard. People are fleeing unimaginable conditions. And then to hear the rhetoric of, well, these people came here illegally. It's like if someone's chasing you with a gun and you entered the library during quiet hours. And then it's like, oh, that's terrible that you entered the library during quiet hours. They were chasing me with a gun, right? There's no sense that these are human beings fleeing for their very lives. So some of the stories I'm going to share are from these experiences, doing these credible fear interviews with folks who had come here, primarily from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. I had a few Brazilians, where there was also some very horrifying gang violence. And I'll say my overwhelming takeaway was that these people were the resilient ones. They're the ones who made it, right? They were dedicated. The idea of living in the United States was this unimaginable paradise to them. People would talk about the United States having the rule of law where, which honestly as Americans we're sometimes cynical about because we don't feel like justice is equitably dispensed, but where they could go to the cops and the cops weren't owned by the gang that they were going to the cops to get protection from. That could exist, or even often existed and not, never, was so mind-blowing to people. The discourse about the United States was this paradise that they wanted to be a part of. They were, tremendously resourceful, hardworking, resilient. Like what it takes to get here is really beyond the pale of what most of us will experience in our lifetimes. And one of the things I would do these intro talks, as I would say, bienvenidos a los Estados Unidos, right? Welcome to the United States. And people would just break down crying because no one had said that to them yet. And some of them had been, months, years in this detention holding pattern, not knowing what was going to be. But it really reminded me of the story that we have of ourselves as a country, of the American dream, of bringing people together with the idea that you can build a future for yourself, that there is possibility here. And so I will say, like, some of the most patriotic Americans that I've met are not, legal citizens. There are these folks who are coming here because they are willing to risk everything for the possibility of becoming an American. And to my mind, that really lays upon us a reciprocal obligation to treat them with fairness, to treat them with dignity, to have a process that doesn't dehumanize people when they are following our laws by seeking to become citizens through an existing legal framework. That said, I guess I'll share maybe one or two stories, and then I'm happy to pause and take questions. But maybe before I go on to the stories, any questions on some of the legal framework, the history? Wants to be the first? Please.
Do you have any sense of what the numbers of people are around this time that are actually processed in?
It's so slow and it's so attenuated. Something like 80% of asylum applications are ultimately rejected. People succeed at very low rates, and part of that is because people are in essentially jail while their application is pending. And when you're in jail, you don't have the ability to build your case. You don't have a phone or a computer to get your documents to show what happened, So, the people who get actually processed through successfully every year, it's very hard to know, and it takes many, many years. The average right now is 4.5 years from the beginning to the end of an asylum application process. I think in the last year, 2.3 million people have been expelled under Title 42 before it stopped being on the books, and then people continue to be kicked out. Month over month, we have months where tons and tons of people show up at the border, and the numbers are only going up on the whole. And then you'll have slower times depending on what the conditions are on the ground. Of those, the number that actually get in, of the people that get in, who actually gets an attorney and gets their case to move forward. Of those, how many cases get granted? It's a really low percentage. I don't know for 2024. I've seen other years, but the numbers are not sticking in my brain right now.
Can I ask a question? So like in Solito, when we have an unaccompanied minor traveling from El Salvador, when there was the influx of unaccompanied minors that number of years ago, was it a similar situation to the book where the parents had already come to the United States and a child was trying to reunite? Or was it parents sending their children to try to get them in first, or was it just a mix?
It's both. Most of the kids who get sent have someone waiting for them. It's not always a parent. Or people will say, okay, go with so-and-so, or an aunt, an uncle, a family friend. That person might be separated from the kid during the process of trying to get here. Parents will say, okay, I can't get myself out, but I can get you out, or we only have enough money for one. The traffickers who sort of help people get there, some folks really do help people get there, some folks not so much, but it's a lot of money. It'll be pretty much everything you have. So families will save for years to send one person, and then you may have somebody on the other end. That person may or may not continue to be available. So it's really a mix. And those kids, a lot of them were young women, some of them were mothers even though they were teenagers, and they separate the genders once the boys hit, I think, 10. So then, these kids will be separated from their siblings. So it's very tough in terms of keeping families together through that process. But it is a mix. Some people will have somebody here, somebody won't.
What if someone simply wants to come from South America, and visit people that they know, and then go back? How would you ever be able to distinguish? Because if I wanted to go and there was a legal way to go visit somebody, I'd just disappear.
So you can apply for a visa to visit a family or friend, and if you have sort of the resources to go visit and return, you may have the resources to apply for a visa. Visa overstays are a separate category. So some people will come and then fall in love and get married or get a job and want to stay, and then it becomes very complicated. If you overstay your visa before you apply for citizenship, you may make yourself ineligible. So it becomes, once you've committed any sort of regulatory infraction, they're very testy about then letting you regularize your status. So it's much better if you apply before you become an overstay. There is some percentage of overstays. Again, I think the discourse about it doesn't match like the real world situation. Like some student comes on a student visa or comes to visit family and they stay. Like America's going to crumble, That's a human being who is, living, has a place to live here, wants to stay here, has relationships here. And the question is, what should we do about that? And to me, that doesn't seem like an emergency at all, right? But okay, they want to stay. If there is some problem with them staying, if that person were to subsequently commit a terrible crime, should we incarcerate them, or do we then return them to their country of origin? Usually they get returned to their country of origin if they don't have citizenship. But barring that, it doesn't seem to me any different from anyone else sort of staying and being here. Honestly, this is a big country. We have a lot of room. We have whole towns in the middle of the country that have roads and clean drinking water and pipes and empty houses. And no reason not to say, if people want to make a life for themselves, they can. Honestly, immigrants contribute tremendously to the economic life of our country, right? Some huge number of folks work, pay money into Social Security that they'll never be able to touch. Right? It's a tremendous amount of dollars that flow both into the economy and the government from these folks who then don't tap government resources because they're not eligible and they're afraid to be picked up. And we make a killing off that, right? That's a ton of money, and yet we treat it as though they're sort of as they've gotten away with something, when in fact we've gotten a tremendous economic value really without that reciprocal social contract of saying, okay, then you can come to the hospital when you're sick and your kids can go to school. So yeah, legally a visa overstay is a separate category, and it does become difficult to put in an asylum application depending on where you are in that process. But it certainly happens. It's not an enforcement priority. The Biden administration certainly has said their enforcement priorities are people who are committing crimes. Doesn't necessarily jive with the reality on the ground, but once people are here, the main risk for them is going to be interfacing with the government in some way, getting picked up for speeding, or having some. Now employers are required to verify citizenship, right? So having some problem with their I-9 when an employer tries to verify citizenship. Those are the risks. Even then, unless you have some employer who's kind of a jerk and is going to call ICE, for the most part, nothing happens. That's changing in places like Texas that have just passed a rule essentially trying to allow Texas law enforcement to enforce federal immigration laws, which is bonkers, right? Texas has no business administering immigration law. They don't have the resources, they don't have the database access, they don't have any of the things that they would need to do this well. Not that the federal government's doing it so well, but what they sort of came up with was, we're going to just stop people who look brown, ask them for their documents, and if they can't prove that they're here, we're going to drive them to the border and kick them across to the other side. So obviously much worse. So for the most part, so those might include folks who are visa overstays. Often it'll be, like most of the folks that I worked with at the border were folks who had crossed through the river and been picked up usually within 24 hours. Because there's just a lot of law enforcement in that area looking for folks. The other thing that's worth saying is that people cross, all of that area around the border is pretty dangerous territory. Every year, thousands of people die trying to cross. They die of dehydration, they die of starvation, they find bodies in the desert. There's actually a nonprofit called the Good Samaritan Project that has dedicated itself to identifying the bodies so that the families can get closure. And they'll send hikers out and they'll leave flats of water bottles and granola bars so that there are some, it's not just hiking through the desert. And people, if somebody falls while you're hiking through the desert, you have this sort of heartbreaking choice to leave them and keep walking or stay with them and die together. Really, really heartbreaking stories of people who gave sort of, to my mind, the last full measure of devotion, trying to become a part of this country. It is a tremendously dangerous place. So the Texas River is one of the safer places to cross, but your likelihood of being picked up almost immediately is very, very high. And if that's your goal, you just wanted to present, you didn't know where to present, that's, you know, it's an option. But all of these options are terrible. It is a terrible option, right? You end up in detention. If you're lucky, you end up back in this camp in Mexico. If you're not, neither is a great place to be, and you're looking at 4.5 years of limbo to even know what your next step is. So it's a humanitarian crisis, and as I said sort of at the beginning, like this is only growing. This is happening around the world, and it's going to continue to happen as the world changes. The safe places to be change, and the rules change, and how to help people get from places where they can't survive to places where they can without putting them through hell is going to be, I think, sort of the moral question of the next generation. How do we do this, or don't we? Right now we are barely, looking back at what's been the past in terms of trying to address, what was the problem. We are barely doing that. We're doing it badly. We're not putting resources into it, and the discourse around it has been so polarizing, loaded with, those people, us and them. They're just coming here to take, and not to give, and not to build this country, right? All of that is already obsolete. Like, it sucks and it's terrible, but that's not even where our heads need to be, right? We have literally millions of people right now. Is it 250 million people displaced in the Sudan, right? Everyone's got to move. We have to figure this out, and we have to do it proactively with some thought for dignity, or the resulting situation that we'll find ourselves in is not a future that any of us want. It's not good for people who are in safe places. It's not good for our children to be living in a world where everyone has sort of died trying to get wherever, and a few lucky people made it, right? That's not a future that we want to be telling the story of for our kids and handing over to them. We need to be proactively thinking about humane immigration as the next frontier of like the global civil rights crisis. Because it's happening, and it's happening faster. It's a train track like melted in Portland, Oregon last summer, right? Like, this is not something that can wait. So I guess I don't even know like where to say what, how people can participate in that effort yet, because all of the advocacy that I've seen, there's probably a few think tanks that are working on it, but all the advocacy right now is addressing the crisis that is, not the crisis that's coming. But the crisis that is well worth addressing. It's very severe, and honestly, our country has no future without immigrants coming in. Our birth rate for folks who are born here is way lower than it would be to replace ourselves, to pay for the Social Security of people who will need Social Security in even 20 years. And without all of these, resilient, idealistic, incoming Americans building the future of the country, we're going to be where Japan and Korea are, where they're trying to pay people to have kids because they know there aren't enough citizens to sustain the infrastructure and future of the country. So we're very lucky to have all these people wanting to participate in our country. And the opportunity is to treat them that way and to create a humane pathway that gives them an opportunity that a lot of the people, all of the people except for Native folks, who are already here, had. They just showed up and said, here, I need to live here because if you send me back, I'll die. And, at some point somebody said, okay, either they, looked more like the existing group of people who were in power, or there were enough of them that they were able to garner the political clout to get in, because we've always had this sort of scarcity mindset about who's allowed to participate in civic life. But it's continued to happen. We've continued to have people come here and press to become included, and then reach some level of inclusion and start to, build the next generation of Americans, and then say, okay, but you people, you can't come in. It keeps happening. But without all the people who have come here, we don't have a country, right? Like all of our history, all the people we're so proud of, the innovations, these are very heavily from people who have come here seeking a better life, and will continue to be. So we need to, create that opportunity. My humble opinion. Please.
So what do you think we should do?
So for now,
is there a country that has a good model to follow?
I can't think of a country that has a good model to follow. A lot of the more developed nations are tremendously xenophobic. Some of them have let in large groups of folks as like a humanitarian measure, but didn't have a plan to help them. to get them jobs and help them get the skills they needed to participate in this economy as opposed to the economy that they came from. So in Germany, for example, took a bunch of folks and didn't really have a plan to integrate them into society and make sure that they had resources and economic participation. And there was a tremendous backlash. It's like, all these people, they're not like us, and they're poor, and they don't have jobs. Well, they don't have jobs because no one helped them, get settled, right? So having not just borders that are, able to be crossed, but also resettlement assistance at scale is really, really key to succeeding and not having it be, just a continued experiment in xenophobia and racism. So I honestly think we need a new model. I don't have a model that I would point to that say those people did it really well, but we need to come up with one. And this is not actually a crisis that we can't fix. Some crises, I don't know if it's within our means to fix. I don't know if we can reverse climate change, and I'm not a scientist. I don't mean to express doubt. I mean to say I personally do not have information. But this one, we have enough food, right? There's absolutely enough calories in the world to do this. We actually have the pipes and the clean drinking water, plenty of places where we can, we have the sanitation, we have the public health infrastructure. It's not that we can't do this, it's that we haven't committed to doing it. So it's to me, it's sort of like the most fire next to the most water, right? This is actually a really fixable problem if we have a will. I always think of in 1960, when we committed to putting a man on the moon. And then by 1969, we had done it. And that was a huge lift, right? And it took a tremendous cross-sector effort. And they just did it because they had the will. Mostly because we were so afraid the other guy was going to do it first, right? That was tremendously motivating. But if we had the will globally to rethink our system of immigration and giving resources to humans, we could do this. This is a crackable nut. We don't have to figure out nuclear fission or whatever the problem is that we haven't solved yet, right? This problem, we have it, all we need to solve it, all we need is will and organization. And that's scarcely.
Jackie, go next, and then we'll pass the mic over. Go ahead, Jackie.
Oh shoot, how am I doing on time?
No, you're good.
Oh, good, okay.
So I'm wondering what happens to the people who, the asylum seekers whose asylum applications are rejected. Do they get bussed back where they came from? Do they get turned away and told to fend for themselves? I can't help worrying about those.
They are deported. If you're in the system and your application is rejected, you're deported. And the question is, where are you deported to? Usually it'll be your country of origin. If you don't have any documentation and you can sort of fool folks into thinking that your country of origin is a different country than your actual country of origin, you might get to go there. So one applicant story that I worked with was this guy from Cuba. And he was able to convince the folks who he was talking to that he was from Mexico. So because going back to Cuba would have been very, very bad. And Mexico was survivable. But, that's, you get deported. You get put on a plane, you get put on a bus. And then if you try to re-enter after having had your application denied, you're not eligible to reapply.
Could you please tell us some personal stories?
Yeah. The one that stays with me most is this mother from Brazil. She was from Minas Gerais, and I actually speak Portuguese because my mom was born in Brazil randomly. And so I learned Spanish, but I also spoke Portuguese, so I saw the Brazilians. And she had run afoul of a gang member. She had her own nail salon, and this gang member wanted her to traffic drugs for him. And she had 2 young kids, one of whom was profoundly disabled. And she said no. And he said, you have until this date or we'll do this particular process to you. I don't want to go into detail, but it was not a pleasant way to die. And it was done not infrequently and very publicly so that people knew, if you cross this gang, this would be what happened to you. She had to leave her profoundly disabled child because she didn't have a way to get that child to the United States safely. But she picked up her 6-year-old daughter and walked to the United States. It took her 9 months, and she was really profoundly traumatized. It was not an easy journey. She was in her mid-20s, and she, I think, sort of stopped allowing herself to to deal with reality in an emotional way and just kind of was like doing the next thing on autopilot, trying to survive. And then she came, she crossed the river at night and was picked up the next morning and had been in detention with her daughter and trying to figure out what had happened to the child that she had to leave behind. So she was writing letters, trying to call. She did not hear back while I was there, but I prepared her for her credible fear interview. And the real crux with so many of these cases was trying to give her a strong case for a particular social group. Because it wasn't that she was targeted because of her race, religion, ethnicity, or national origin. So if you got one of those, it puts you in a category that gives you an easier legal case. And she had to say, my particular social group is like people who refuse to work with gangs. Which is, you never know how that's going to go. It depends on who your asylum officer is. Now, these asylum officers are not lawyers, they're not judges. They have absolute power and really almost no review. So I've seen asylum officers deny cases for reasons that make no sense, right? There's one, this is like infamous instructional video where somebody's making a claim based on religion. This was a Christian, I think, coming from China. And he asked her who the head of her church was, her particular church. And it was this Bishop John somewhere. And he said, and she told him that, and he said, that's not, like, he tells the camera, he's like, that's not true, the head is so-and-so. He's wrong, she's right, and he denies her application. Right? He just was ignorant about it. He had the wrong idea in his head. But her life is the one that's over, because he just didn't know. And she doesn't have due process rights. She's not a citizen, she can't, she can ask for reconsideration. Maybe she'll get it, maybe she won't, maybe it'll go to the same guy, right? There's really no sort of mechanism for fairness because non-citizens really don't have these sort of same rights to access the courts. They don't have the same due process rights, which as an American I think really offends your sensibility. It's like we expect that you'll have the right to tell your story and that somebody can't just deny you for no reason. They have to explain why, and then you get to, and that's just not true for most of these folks. Yeah, I had another woman who was kept in a basement by her intimate partner for 3 years.
What happened with the Brazilian?
You never get to know. Her credible fear interview she passed while I was there, but the process takes years, and I'm there for a week at a time. So while I was there, I prepared her, and she passed her credible fear interview. She came back to tell me the guards yelled at her for coming back without an appointment, but she was glowing. She was so happy, and I'm really glad that happened. And I don't know. I don't know if she was able to pass. As an attorney, you sign a contract with the volunteer group that coordinates the attorneys who go there for that period of time, and then you lose your access to the information, I think 2 months after you leave. So you do a chunk of time so you can answer questions. So I can't go back and check on her case even a year later. But so I know she passed her credible fear interview, and you get these small windows of time for each case that you see. So as I was saying, I had one case with a woman who was locked in a basement by her intimate partner for 3 years. And she was able to show that her particular social group wasn't women experiencing intimate partner violence, but rather because of her race. Because one of the things that he would say when he was abusing her was that she was dark-skinned. Because there's this sort of colorist idea that having darker skin is not as beautiful, and this was part of his story that he would say as he was being abusive toward her, that she was not good enough because her skin was darker, and so she was able to say this was racial discrimination. My particular, my group is a racial group, and that's why I am in fear for my life. And so she was able to succeed on her credible fear interview for that reason. But it's really kind of luck of the draw. It'll be like what some people remember. It'll be, an epithet that you've never heard of because it's, in a different cultural group. So, if somebody says, Morena's pretty obvious, but there's one that's a certain animal that's a small monkey, and people might say that name is either an affectionate or not affectionate way to say somebody with darker skin, and you have to unpack with each story. Well, what did they mean by that? Well, my mother was Quiche, and he was insulting me because my family is indigenous, or what, but you won't know unless you ask and ask and ask and ask. And I'll say that I think the process is really dehumanizing. This person is telling me, this lawyer they've never met before, their most personal, painful experiences in And for them to do that is life or death. If they don't tell me, I can't help them. If they don't tell this asylum officer, you know, they get their claim denied, right? But everything we know about trauma tells us that they should get to control, you know, if, when, how they disclose, and the response they get during a disclosure. And instead, it's this incredibly sort of punitive confessional system where you have to like make your pain available to be judged worthy or unworthy of, you know, admission to this one place where you won't die.
This has been so much great information. Is there anything that you could say in closing that any of us could do to help? Is it looking who to vote for? Is it looking who to donate to? What would you tell us we could do as just even a small action?
Yeah, so I'll say, you know, voting is tremendously important. Voting in national elections, voting in local elections. Who, for example, the sheriff is depends on, you know, how the sheriff's office will respond to people they pick up and suspect of being non-citizens, right? Those are local elections, and those actually do have an impact on these kinds of issues. And then I would say, you know, donate your money to ALA, for example, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the Pro Bono Project in Dilley. There's a number of them now, Raíces, Texas, organizations that help folks who come here. There are also organizations that help resettle folks and, you know, pick people up from a bus station and make sure they have a meal. And you know, that's a great way to do it. I think the other thing is to really talk about it. You know, say it in every room you walk into. Post it on, I hate social media, but post it on your social media. Talk to your family and friends. The more the demand from the average American citizen is that this is unacceptable, the less we'll hear things like Biden using the word illegals in the State of the Union. He's doing that for a reason, right? Because this immigration issue is so polarizing and he doesn't want to lose the election over it. Man, I don't want him to lose the election. I'm terrified of that. But he thinks he has to use that dog whistle to save himself, right? And that's on us as a country, right? That's our culture, that's our discourse. And we get to take ownership of it by participating in it, as unpleasant, and it is very unpleasant as it is. The more we speak up and the more we make it sort of unacceptable in polite society to demonize people who are seeking a better life and safety, the more we change that reality. So it's not a quick fix, and it's not necessarily very satisfying, but I do believe that it is, that's our labor in this moment, is to make that change sort of slowly.
Thank you so much for being here. So great. The story of this man's journey.